coming over is I was like, well, it's not really so much to teach you a lesson; it's to teach you that I'm worth waiting for. Jacob is what it was coming
Oh,
down
is,
to.
is that is that why I showed up when you told me to, only to wait for 15 minutes?
How
Is
does
that it?
it feel? Yeah.
I'm surprised. It's really unpleasant. Little did I know that making people wait my whole life, this is how
uh,
it felt.
now,
I
for
mean,
once,
dang.
we weren't on Jacob time.
I don't like it, Mike. I think we need to get
hmm
back on Jacob time.
yeah. You Easterners, always so slow with everything.
Welcome to the Voyage podcast, a show that traverses the oceans of myth and legend through the lens of Catholic theology and philosophy. Come aboard as we set sail in pursuit of the heroic life and Christian virtue, with your hosts, Mike Schramm and Jacob Platty.
Well, this one,
just economia.
this one's kind of your baby. If you want to lead us off.
Yeah, this is kind of my baby. This is gonna be all right. So today we're gonna be talking about Christ the Eternal Tao, right? That's
hmm
kind of the idea here. It's inspired by a book written by an Eastern Orthodox monk that was really influential when I was starting to look into other forms of Christianity than Protestant Christianity. And so I think the joke I can make here is that this is going to be like the most Taoist episode ever, which is to say there is no outline, there is no plan, there
Well,
is no momentum to move forward. We're all just going to kind of like zen out and kind of ruminate on
I have a
where
confession,
the
Jacob.
conversation takes us, bro.
I have a
Oh
confession.
no,
I made an outline. I made an outline. So I do have some. I do have some
Mike,
talking points. I know,
that's not very Taoist of you.
isn't it?
That's
Isn't
uh already you're like a Confucius to my Lao Tzu. So one of the things that actually got this whole conversation going was I was surfing through Audible, right? I like to listen to a lot of audiobooks these days. And
mm,
I noticed one that showed up on the free to listen thing was the Tao of Pooh.
hmm
Now, don't freak out, folks. We're
don't
talking about the yellow bear.
don't. Yeah,
Without context, I mean, it could be weird, right?
sure, sure.
Oh, is that too low brow for you, Mike?
you
You're being
just
a real rabbit right now, let me tell you.
yeah.
Again,
Okay.
the character Rabbit from Winnie the Pooh, the classic by A. Milne.
hmm Yeah.
Or
So the
as I knew it, the cartoon that my little brother obsessed over when I
yeah
was
the
about 3 years
Disney
older than
cartoon.
him. Well, there was the movie, but then they made, like, the TV show.
Yeah,
Pooh
I
Bear,
meant the
Winnie
TV
the
show. Disney
Pooh
cartoon.
Bear, look at
Yeah,
the
I'm familiar.
I'm in a honey tree, Pooh Bear. See, that's how much Winnie the Pooh I've watched in my day, and I
Oh yeah,
swear it was because of my little brother. I
it's
promise.
catchy. Yeah, no, it's
Yeah, well, I
catchy.
mean, that's still, like, what, 30 years later, I still remember those lyrics.
D- Disney did
You know
have
what?
like
They
a
were good. They were, now that I'm old enough to not worry about, being not cool for liking Winnie
mm,
the Pooh, though I don't know, maybe I
n-
shouldn't speak. Maybe a
Disney kind of had
37-year-old
like
shouldn't like Winnie the Pooh.
they
I
had
don't
a
know.
reboot of the cartoon movie. Disney did. I think it was in like 2000. I want to say 2010 maybe or 2011. And then they
Yeah,
also did a sort of a live action. Well, and they've done like a young Christopher Robin movie too. Actually, they've done a few things
they
since
did. Well,
then.
I
Yeah,
didn't actually check any of those out. There was the one that was like Ewan McGregor, right? And he's
yeah,
playing
that was
like a
the
grown-up
Christopher Robin
Christopher
one.
Robin. Did you watch
Yeah.
that? Have you seen that?
I remember watching it with my family a while ago.
What's the
We
premise?
like a lot of those.
Is it like Hook? Is it like Christopher Robin goes back to
Like
like the 100-acre
revisiting
wood, and then he has to like fight whatever, a Huffalump or
you know
something, and
my
remember his childhood?
my level of research for this one is a little bit lower, Jacob, since it was your topic. So no, it's been yeah, that one,
Appropriate,
and it's
appropriate.
relatively recent, but yeah, it's on that one's on Disney Plus too, and
It must not have made a
it's a
huge
very
impression
like
on you.
it's like a nice kind of comforting like sort of space to play in the 100-Acre Wood. Like, it actually kind of touches on the sort of like entering into fairy world, like we've sort of talked about in so many of our episodes.
The themes of that movie
Is
does? The Christopher Robin one?
No, I just mean the whole Winnie the Pooh idea, right? Because it's
Oh,
kind of
sure.
like it's stuffed animals, but they're real to him and they come alive, and that's, as a child he's entering into that. And I think it is, as an adult, sort of like, kind of reminds me of like the Mary Poppins thing too, where it's like you become
Very
a kid
Mary
again and
Poppins-like,
enter
yeah.
into and you become
They
a
go
kid
into the
again,
painting
enter
in the
into that
movie.
world. So like I said, I think without going back in and reading over it again or watching it again, I think that's what it was. But yeah, I'd be open to correction on that.
But
But that's not even, I mean, that's obviously like the premise that Benjamin Hoff, the author of Tao of Pooh, uses. But that's not even like, and like you called me a rabbit, and so that's going to play into what we're going to talk about in a little bit too. But
that's true.
anyway, yeah.
So evidently you do have a fairly decent memory of reading Tao of Pooh, because you read it a couple years back, you said, right?
I think I listened to the audiobook too, actually. And
did you?
yeah, it was one of those that so it wasn't for free on Audible. I got it because you could check out audiobooks from the library, and so that's where I remember, because I don't own it either.
So you were like listening to it on like cassette tape in your
No. It was on an app on your phone. It was on your app. Like, it's a library
came in one
app.
of those big plastic cases that like pops
I think it was
together
records,
kind of thing.
and I put it on the record. Yeah.
Okay. Well, anyway, yeah, honestly, yeah. So the cartoon back in the day, actually, I was exposed to it so much that eventually it grew on me, and then it was like no longer such a hassle to watch it, even though I was older than my little brother who was doing it. So
and
you know
get to
what?
revisit it as an adult when you have kids, and that's always a
Go
nice,
check it out. Go check it out. So the Tao of Pooh was this book that was written by his name was what, Hoff, you said, or is it Hoffman?
Yeah.
I forget.
Hoff.
Yeah.
Yep.
Which this guy, he must have been, I actually have no context for this person. Like, he must have been someone who was making a little bit of a splash back in the 80s, because
And the book came out in 83, so yeah, it's been around.
like making the rounds.
I guess this would be the 40-year anniversary.
How appropriate. That's why, like, if you're just floating through life, bro, things just fall into place like that, because that's how the Tao works, bro.
Oh yeah, just going with
I'm
the
just
flow.
gonna
That's one of the chapters.
I'm gonna throw a lot of bros out in this, I can tell, because I'm gonna be in that parlance. It's just gotta go with it, bro. You just gotta go with it. I'm gonna try not to do that. I started saying bro ironically a long time ago. A long time ago
always
now.
starts.
It's just like it was a funny little ironic thing to say, and yeah, before you know it,
like, wouldn't it be so funny if you started saying bro? Like, and you lived in Hawaii for a while, so maybe it was you being around all the surfers or something.
Yeah, maybe that's what it was. So I'm listening to the audiobook a couple weeks back, and I'm enjoying it because, frankly, I hadn't really revisited Taoism in any meaningful sense for
Had you never heard the book or heard the audiobook before? Like, this was the first time you've heard it?
I think
a couple of weeks ago? Okay.
Yeah, I would say I don't think that it definitely wasn't on my radar. It's one of those things where I might have seen it on one of those like center tables at Barnes and Noble.
Yeah.
Right? But like no, it wasn't in my life in any meaningful sense. But I remember actually being in high school as I was starting to explore like different religions and things like that around the time that I was graduating, and picking up the Tao Te Ching, and just kind of being mystified by it, but in a really intriguing way, right? I think like reading the Tao Te Ching was one of those things that I don't know, might have just opened my eyes to a different way, no pun intended,
Okay.
of
you were on top
like,
of that one. That's good.
of kind of like doing spirituality kind of thing, right? Up until that moment.
So yeah, what is the Tao? Like, when you, because we've used the word a couple of times and stuff. So expand on just when you've experienced it and your background of it and stuff.
Right. The Tao is the way, right? That's literally what it means. It means the way. And so I think that we briefly touched on that when we were talking about the Mandalorian episodes. We were talking about the way and things like that. Yeah, a total throwback to this idea that's introduced in Taoism, right? Lao Tzu, he was the quasi mythical founder of this school of thought. He was operating in an era around the same time as Confucius. And this
Mm.
all would have been taking place, if I'm not mistaken, this is roughly 25, well, like 500 BC, so about 2,500 years ago. Maybe
Mm.
I'm wrong on that. That's just off the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure that's true. And so, whereas Confucianism and Confucius, who was a court magistrate guy, that was very much about formality. That was very much about the social order. It was very much about the hierarchy as such, honestly,
Yeah.
in the order of being and things like that, and the proper relationships that everyone has. Which, to be perfectly honest, I'm all about all of that as well. I think that's a really huge elements of how Christianity, classical Christianity, and Christendom as such, organized and kind of was led by the Spirit into being as it's, continued to grow and things like that within history.
Yeah.
Um, so there's nothing wrong with that as such. But nevertheless, Lao Tzu emerges as a counterpoint to that. And he's basically the total opposite. So if Confucius is like the uppity bureaucrat, then Lao
Mm.
Tzu is the um what would you say? The person who is like a total hippie out in the woods,
Yeah.
quit ruining my vibes, man,
Well,
kind of
it's
thing.
almost like you get the sense that yeah, one is very you know, you could almost say like politically minded, not political in the sense of like political parties, but more like the body politic,
Like
like
Aristotle
acting in
almost.
the
Yeah.
yeah, and then whereas Lao Tzu is the like you kind of said, the more kind of hippie, like out in the wilderness, almost like prophetic figure or whatever. And
He is very much like a prophetic figure. Absolutely.
yeah.
So, oh,
Yeah,
go
go
on.
no, go
Sorry.
ahead. Well,
No, I
no,
was
and
about to say
so
you have you have the
it's
courtier,
presenting
and
this.
then you have the prophet out in the woods kind of thing. But what were you
Yeah.
gonna say?
Well, and so it's discovering this way, and I didn't want to say that one was practical and that one was more like abstract, because I think both of them would be described depending on what perspective you're coming from as practical. It's just what do you mean by practical, right? One of them is practical in the sense of, like you said, the bureaucratic, like how to almost like how to make win friends and make progress or whatever, whereas the other one is
Win
how to
friends and make
actually like
progress.
yeah,
I
whereas
thought
the
you were
other one
like
is
how to influence people, like that book, how
yeah,
to like.
that's honestly what I was grasping at, and I just
Yeah,
kind
I
of
know. I can't
messed
think
up on
of
the
the
name.
title either.
But well, yeah, win friends and influence people. Whereas the other one is more the kind of like how to expand your mind or become this, better version of yourself, so to speak. And
Sure.
so in a
Well,
sense, they're
kind of.
both practical, right? But
Yeah, I would say practical. That's an interesting word. I don't think I've ever heard anyone like apply the word practical to Taoism, and I don't mean that in
mm,
like a mean spirited way. I don't. My interpretation of Taoism, and I'm not some kind of like pristine Taoist monk guy, so take this as a grain of salt. I am just some Western dude who was impressed by it.
well, and that's
Once
all the
upon a
Tao of
time.
Pooh is some Western dude who was impressed by it and
I
found
think that he
a
probably took it a
found
little
a
bit more seriously than I did, but
Western analog. But
yeah, well, and that was put a pin in that. We'll get to that. But like
okay,
Taoism as such is about it's about effortlessness.
mm,
Taoism is about going with the flow of life and not putting too much burden on yourself for being this way or that way, but simply existing, right? Now the problem
yeah,
is what I just said makes it sound like it's total amoral, kind of anarchic, kind of um
like a total retreat
Uh,
from
yeah,
life, total
retreat
retreat
from
from the
from
world.
sociability as such, right? And so
Mm,
what's hard about trying to pin down Taoism and describe it in a nutshell is that that's not at all what Taoism is trying to achieve. And so Taoism is not a licentiousness. Taoism is not a get out of jail free card to be antisocial and things like that. What Taoism
mm,
is trying to do is remove anxiety from people by putting them in the context of, you know, nature and life goes about its way. And in doing that, everything falls into place.
Yeah, I think
Everything takes care of itself.
harmony would be a
Harmony's great.
good sort of like word to describe the kind of the outlook or the mentality, right? Is
Right.
what how do you put yourself in a position to be the most harmonious with the life, around you or the world around you. And so, and we'll kind of get into this when we get into some of the chapters or some of the different things that are said in the Tao of Pooh. But maybe, well, before we do that, what about, because one of the things that definitely resonates, not just with this as like a, I guess, what'd you say, pop culture, like phenomenon, or how this resonates with pop culture, but how does it resonate with Christianity as well? Because you see the element of the Tao sort of not incorporated in Christianity, or you could say runs parallel to Christianity, because there is some overlapping space. And so we can
Well,
kind of get into that too.
let me rewind a little bit. So a little bit later on in life, I'm so I'd started to casually explore just other religious traditions in my early 20s, right? Not practicing them, but just exploring what other religions had to say and things like that.
Mm.
And Taoism was one that I really appreciated. It was just different. I was such an analytical mind back then that Taoism was a challenge to that. And it was just interesting to kind of opened up the world a little bit. So it turns out there is a Eastern Orthodox monk within America. His name was Father Seraphim Rose, and he was really, really influential Orthodox person in the 70s and 80s, basically. He started a monastery out in California. But prior to becoming an Eastern Orthodox monk, he had been a dedicated Taoist disciple of a really, really uh, I guess, erudite Taoist teacher. His name started with a G. Again, as is my want, did not prepare for this at all. I think it was like Genshin or Genji or something like that. But anyway, I'm just gonna refer to him as his
Okay.
teacher. Um,
Yeah.
but and he basically laid a lot of foundation for Father Seraphim Robe's eventual trajectory into Eastern Orthodoxy, ironically enough. And so,
Yeah.
what's really interesting about it is that you have a Eastern mystical tradition with a American disciple, right? And somehow that
Hmm.
American disciple ends up finding mystical Christianity and dedicating himself to that in a very rigorous way.
Yeah.
Father Seraphim Rose is really quite a traditional voice within the Orthodox Church, and really inspirational for a lot of people, myself included.
Hmm.
And so he had a son in the faith, a spiritual disciple who Father Damascene, Hieromonk Damascene,
Who wrote
who wrote a
Christ the
book.
Eternal Tao?
Yeah. So
Yeah.
he was a disciple of Father Seraphim Rose. He wrote this book, Christ the Eternal Tao. And so when I saw this book, Christ the Eternal Tao, it immediately caught my attention because I had been, I had really enjoyed a lot of like Taoist tenets and things like that. And so I decided to pick up this book. It gives a really, really great biography of Father Seraphim Rose. In a lot of ways, it's kind of dedicated to his spiritual father, Father Seraphim. And
Yeah.
it gives his history. And then it goes into a basically just comparison between the basic tenets of Taoism and the basic tenets of Christianity as it understands in Christ. And it
Well, yeah,
makes
showing that crossover, that overlapping that we're going to
it
get
well,
into too.
it makes the claim that Christ is the Tao, is the
Hmm.
way. And the Tao Te Ching, we didn't, actually say this yet. The Tao Te Ching means the book of the way and its power, or the book of the power of the way, depending upon how you
Hmm.
want to translate it. So the Tao, Tao, but it has a D sound. And
Yeah.
Day, Te, and then Ching. That's is pretty phonetic right there. Um, the power, the day, is equated to grace. And so, in that translation, in that interpretation, you have Christ who is the way, and then his power is the grace that is brought through to us through the Holy Spirit and through the church and all that stuff. Now, what's immediately going to be, I think like a traditional Taoist, um, there's different schools of Taoism, and so some of those schools actually are quite ritualistic, from what I
Uh-huh.
understand. And then there's kind of Taoism as a philosophy as such. And that type of philosophical Taoism is going to be completely unencumbered by any type of, um, really any type of whatever mandate at all, I would assume, right?
Mhm.
Again, I don't claim to be a super, professional or expert on this, but like because the very notion of Taoism, I'll give you a really, really good parable. Well, actually, we'll see if I remember this really good parable. But
Okay.
basically,
Oh,
the Lao Tzu,
I'm going back to the chips. I
so
gotta get my
he
popcorn out.
goes. You have I don't know if it's Lao Tzu or if it's maybe one of Lao Tzu's disciples, right? But he's walking along, he's on a journey or whatever, and he comes to a river. And long story short, instead of trying to figure out how to get over the river, he takes the river as a sign that he's like reached his destination. And so he just like sits. And he's like, okay, well, this must be where I'm supposed to stop because I have no way of
Hmm.
getting over the river. So I guess this is where I'm supposed to be. Right.
Yeah.
That in a nutshell gives you an idea of kind of like what Taoism kind of puts you in the mindset for, where it's like, don't quit. There's another kind of phrase associated with Taoism. Let's see if I don't butcher this one too. It's like quit trying, quit trying to quit trying. Wait, quit trying, quit quitting, quit quitting to quit trying to quit trying or something like that.
Yeah.
So if you take those 3 statements, like, together, it gives you the sense of, like, well, how do I take any action at all, right?
Yeah.
Like, what am I supposed to do? Like, how am I supposed to maneuver with that?
Quit.
What type of guidance is that? And, yeah, the basic idea is, it's like you're already trying too hard. Like,
Mm.
don't worry about it. Just,
Well, and
you know what's right,
almost
you know what's
like
wrong, go ahead and do that and don't worry about it too much.
and almost to try to like redeem that in some way, there is a virtue of not passivity, because on the surface that feels very much like
Comes
just pure
across as super
passivity,
especially to the
which
Western mind.
well, yeah,
Taoism
and
comes across as the most illogical, passive, uh, almost
but
infuriating. Almost like,
but
"What are you talking about? You have to
we do
do
have
something in life,"
we
you
do
know?
have a model for this, because we would refer to this as long as it comes from a place of humility and charity. But we have the model of the Theotokos as one who is receptive and docile. And so monks and priests and religious sisters will look to her as a model of receptivity for the grace of God, for the Holy Spirit, whether we're talking the Annunciation, but also her role in leading up to Pentecost as well, as being that one who is receptive to the Holy Spirit, whether it's at the conception of Jesus or at the, in a sense, conception of the church at Pentecost too.
That actually well, and so one of the things that I'll say since we're in this kind of, like, Eastern context for today's conversation is, early on, what I kinda realized when I was thinking about the Theotokos, when I was thinking about, um how to understand Mary, right? Because I'm coming from a Protestant background. I'm coming from a tradition that uh, grapples, doesn't quite understands the big to do when it comes to Mary. And one of the things, for better or for worse, right? Take most of what I say with a grain of salt, but was that I realized that Mary isn't isn't God. She's not a replacement for Jesus. She's not Jesus, right? And there's no concern there. But in some sense, what Mary is within the context of the Christian story is something similar to what like the Buddha is in the context of Buddhism. Because in
Mm-hmm.
Buddhism, the path is not like Buddha per se. The path is nirvana. You're trying to get to this
Well,
place of like imminent peace. And what Buddha is, who Buddha is as a person, is the human figure, the not divine human figure that opened up the path to
yeah.
nirvana by walking it himself first. And there's a lot of parallels with the
Well, that's
Theotokos. Jesus
And
in
see, and
that
that's the thing
context.
is so many people when they want to like conflate all the or syncretize all the religions is they'll just compare everyone to Jesus because well Jesus is the main figure for Christianity and Buddha is the main figure for Buddhism and Muhammad is the main figure for Islam, even though you're actually misunderstanding all three of those faiths because for one, Christians believe something fundamentally different about who Jesus is, and Muslims believe something fundamentally different about who Muhammad is, and Buddhists believe, but it's also like, so if I'm somebody from a Christian standpoint trying to understand Islam, I have to understand who Muhammad is from the Muslim perspective. I have to understand who the Buddha is from the Buddhist perspective. And then on the flip side, they have to see not just who Jesus is, but like you said, the closer parallel is actually Mary because she becomes that human person, not the divine person with a human nature, but the human person in terms of receptivity to God's grace, receptivity in terms of, and
Who
that's where
opens
we
the
come
way
from.
for everybody else?
Yeah.
Who lays the foundation literally, right? Because she gives her flesh to Christ, right?
Mhm.
Who is the origin story for Jesus, in his human nature anyway. And so she is kind of like the Eastern Gate, right? We refer
Yep.
to her as such sometimes.
Yeah. Or the
A
temple
kind of
gate
gate.
from the Old Testament. Yep.
hmm And so, let's hear. I'm bringing up who Mary is in that regard because you were talking about how she is this example of kind of like passivity that actually affects results,
Well,
right?
and so yeah, we wouldn't
Passivity,
use the word passive. We
receptivity.
use receptivity or docility, right? That you're
Mhm.
you're teachable, that you are receptive to, the way or the work that God wants to do in you, which God eventually does work through her, whether we're talking bringing Jesus into the world or being that messenger to Elizabeth and being that companion to Elizabeth, being the one who institutes Jesus' ministry at the wedding at Cana, and then the one who, in a sense, ushers in the Holy Spirit at Pentecost, right? Bringing about what God's plan for the church.
Well, and that's exactly it. Because what Taoism ultimately is trying to get a person to do is to empty themselves out so that they can naturally be used for like the way, the Tao, right? In their context, the Tao is this harmonious natural order. And so what happens is we fill ourselves up with all kinds of distractions, all kinds of demands or burdens or whatever you want to say, um, passions, to use good Christian language, that prevents us from being usable by God, by the way, by Christ, right? So the parallels actually become really, really apparent once you start realizing that what Christianity as a path, as a way, and let's not forget that Christianity, before it was referred to as Christianity, was simply referred to as the way.
Mm-hmm.
It's just the way. And Christ himself calls himself the way, right? And so
Yeah.
there's reasons why, the Christ, the eternal Tao, is not a syncretistic text. It looks like it. I'll be the first to admit that it looks like it if you're just someone who's, like, going through, like, the bookstore and you see it on a shelf, it's like,
Well,
"Oh, some weirdo tried to, like, merge Christianity and Taoism," or
and
something like that.
honestly, like a lot of what we do on this show on the surface could appear that way, as if we're trying to like just say, oh, well, Christianity is just like the MCU or Christianity is just like the ancient Greek myths because we're finding the parallels. But as you, I think, are kind of getting into, and maybe I cut you off a little bit, is that these are examples of what St. Justin Martyr calls the seeds of the word.
Yep,
And
yep.
so Christians can look at the Tao or Taoism and say that was just as much a seed of the word as go back to, remember when we were talking about the death of Superman and the Corn King? And it's like C.S. Lewis and Tolkien saw those as seeds of the word.
Sure.
And in the early Christians, they saw, right, the St. Paul saw the poets and the ancient Greek myths when he was talking on Mars Hill as seeds of the word as well. Now, he didn't use the phrase seeds of the word. That's from St. Justin Martyr, but who was
Right.
St. Justin Martyr? He was a pagan philosopher who converts to Christianity precisely
Mhm.
because he saw those same seeds and saw them growing into the fruition of Jesus Christ.
Well, and so when we say that God is the God of everything, right? It is to say that Christ is the fulfillment not just of the Old Testament Jewish religion.
Mm-hmm.
Christ is the fulfillment of all religions. Christ is
Mhm.
the fulfillment of all paganism. What Justin Martyr saw was that Christ in Christianity, the way, as he would have probably understood it, at the time he was writing, was what pagan philosophy was trying to get
Anything
at
that was
root.
true in pagan philosophy, anything that was
Yeah,
true in Greek mythology, anything true in the Tao is
and so
ultimately fulfilled. Yeah.
what you have are some really, I can't stress this enough, hyper traditionalist um, Eastern Orthodox monks, right? I mean, these are people who are not syncretistic. They are the furthest thing from it, but they themselves have created both Father Seraphim Rose and his disciple Hieromonk Damascene have basically produced this book that points out the what Lao Tzu, the figure of Lao Tzu and his disciples, were looking for when trying to define the way, when trying to practice the way, when they were trying to follow the way. Um, Hieromonk Damascene claims that Christ is the way they were trying to find. Christ
Mhm.
is the way that is the ultimate embodiment of like this kind of cosmic way that Taoism refers to. Um, Let me share. Well, I was about to say I could because the first chapter, the Tao Te Ching, it's 100 and is it 150 chapters? Should really prepare for these sometimes.
I mean,
But like like it's a number of chapters, right? But they come in different lengths, right? They come in all shapes and sizes. But the very first chapter, the Tao Te Ching, is almost like a synopsis of the entire book, right? And so
mhm.
I don't know, maybe just for funsies, I'll go ahead. I googled it just so I could read it.
Well, and before we get there too, so the another example of this sort of Christian crossover, because one of the most popular examples of a Christian writer speaker in the last 100 years has been C.S. Lewis, and C.S. Lewis was very much a one of the images that he did use. Not so much when he was maybe rediscovering Christianity in his adulthood, was he refers to it as a Tao as well. And we were talking
Mhm.
about this off the air or beforehand, that I'm pretty sure I see him use that expression in Mere Christianity as well as Abolition of
Yeah, I
Man.
think
We're
he
both
does.
pretty. I think it's
Yeah,
in
I think
both,
he
but
uses that in the
definitely in
early
Abolition of Man.
chapters. Yeah, when he's talking about because he is equating it with like, the kind of natural law, right?
Yep. Yeah.
Within the Christian context.
So you have this
Um,
idea that the knowledge, a partial knowledge of God or incomplete knowledge of God and God's will is knowable through the natural world and through our natural human reason, human faculties. And so you have all this like, well, it's part of our human nature. We can grasp at some of these things, which goes back to when you were talking about Christ, the eternal Tao. The Father Seraphim, Hieromonk Damascene, they recognize that too, that just because the Lao Tzu had this human nature, the same human nature that a baptized person has, they can recognize, maybe incompletely, maybe imperfectly, that there are elements to, the revealed way of Jesus and the church.
Absolutely. And so what Christianity teaches is that, we are our human nature is still intact, but it's been corrupted with sin. And what is natural, what is instinctual, what is native to us is still there, but it's clouded, right? And so, Taoism is going to refer to like natural humanity as the thing that's unclouded by all the crud that we, you know, heap upon ourselves, which is the sin within Christianity, right? Christ is the embodiment because at the end of the day, being made in the image of God is what that natural humanity looks like, right? And so Christ is the God that we're made in the image of, right? So he is the way. And then when you start to get into this idea of like the power of the way, the power of God, uh,
Mm.
for the Christian, that is what grace is, right? So this all gets kind of like elucidated in that Christ the Eternal Tao book, right?
Mm.
And then he has
All
really
500 pages of it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's like
I
that
was
thick, but
no, there's a
it's
lot of pictures too. I
there's a
noticed.
lot.
I was able to find the PDF online, so because
For
I
you?
know
They
I
have really
bugged you about.
pretty borrowing it, yeah, before because we
I,
talked about doing this episode like a month or 2 ago,
and
right?
I said, "Oh, hey, lend me that book next time we see each other." And that was how many months ago? But
Yeah, when did we see each other? But it's actually got really since you mentioned the pictures, it has really, really pretty commissioned artwork from a native Chinese artist of images from the Gospels. And so
yeah,
you have images of like Christ in the boat, right? But it's done in that kind of like classical Chinese minimalist way. It's very pretty.
no, and it's good for it's similar to icons. It's good for reflection and contemplation, because it does strike you as new or different than probably what we're used to seeing in terms of sacred art.
It does, yeah. Um, I remember being in it was actually an icon working class, and it was for a bunch of people that were kind of new um, and kind of outside the tradition of painting icons. And so people that were entering in that class came to it from different kind of like levels of familiarity with iconography and all that type of thing. And some of the examples that were being shown as we were like, going through some PowerPoints prior to actually doing the classes and things like that is just Christian art from around the world throughout all the ages. And one of those things was the Book of Kells with Christ. There's a really famous image of Christ, illuminated manuscript style in the Book of Kells.
Mm,
But he's got blonde hair and blue eyes, right?
mm,
And there were some people who kind of took offense at that. They're like, "Oh, he wasn't blonde-haired and blue-eyed, right?" And it's
yeah.
like, yeah, but Irish people in 400 AD weren't worried about what Jesus looked like. They were worried about communicating the truth of Christ to the people
Mm,
that were receiving Christ, right? And so there's other examples in, Chinese art where you have Jesus like in the lotus flower, right? I don't know if I've ever
mm.
seen an image of him doing like the lotus position type thing, but
Oh
like
boy.
still it's him. Yeah, I don't know. That might be a little too far. But like but there is him and he's like, standing in the lotus flower because the lotus flower is the symbol of wisdom in the East,
Mm,
right? And so the way that imagery, Christianity has a tradition of redeeming the culture of peoples, right? And so when you see images like they're depicted in this Christ the Eternal Tao book, um, no one should be surprised by that. I mean, they might be surprised just because they're so unused to it, but really, I think they're very beautiful to look
mm,
at. But anyway, most of the book is basically a chunk of it is just the life of Father Seraphim Rose, and then a chunk of it is kind of like an essay on pointing out like, you know, the parallels that Lao Tzu was trying to achieve. Hiram Monk
mm,
Damsing goes so far as to say that Lao Tzu is the person on the earth closest to achieving the truth outside of God's revelation, outside of like
yeah.
God coming down and actually like helping humans figure it out. You
You
have
had
an
some
individual.
church fathers who said similar things about like Plato and Socrates too.
Yeah,
That,
well,
yeah.
because there are some people, and Lao Tzu is a kind of like he is like a prophet figure, frankly,
Mm,
really explicitly so. So anyway, most of that book is actually kind of a poetic, theological, like theology book, where it's actually just going through concepts like the Trinity and the Incarnation and Christology and all that stuff. But it's writing about it poetically, and it's writing about
mm,
it in a way that kind of imitates how the Tao Te Ching reads. In other words, kind of like mystically, whatever.
yeah.
It's very poetic, right? But anyway, it was a very influential book for me when I was leaving Protestantism, not just because I had this kind of uh, accidental attraction to kind of Eastern woo woo, but it broke down a lot of theology. It broke down
Yeah.
the life of a saintly monk. It
Well,
showed me ways of
it was sort
doing
of the
things.
spoonful of sugar that helped the kind of like deeper, more classical
Nice.
theology go down, because that's what kind of helps it, right? I mean, in the same way that
Absolutely.
like oftentimes, we'll sometimes complain about how a certain political agenda is sort of like snuck into some piece of artwork or some, as if like every piece of artwork doesn't have some deeper idea or some deeper element. Now when it becomes sort of hackneyed is when it's super obvious, or not just that it's like a political position you don't like, but when they're not even trying at the art aspect of it. And like what you were saying is, you have this in many ways, or to some minds, not super attractive, like deep, whether it's Eastern Christian theology or Catholic theology or whatever. Like if you gave just somebody a Catholic theology textbook about the Trinity or about the incarnation or whatever, no one's going to read a 500-page textbook. But when it's sort of presented in this, like you kind of said, poetic package, or presented as, according to this way, that's what, in a sense, made the more Eastern Christian theology like more palatable to, like you said, you're coming from this kind of like more modern Protestant taste,
analytical,
yeah,
for sure, real kind of heady and things like that.
Your Kantian kind of approach to knowledge, and stuff.
pretty much, definitely an inheritor of kind of later Western tradition. Let's just say that. So anyway, a lot of that was all just kind of laying out why I picked up the Tao of Pooh to begin with, right? But I thought that was really charming. It's really quite short.
So the tagline from the book is, while Eeyore frets, and Piglet hesitates, and Rabbit calculates, and Owl pontificates, Pooh just is.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of sums it up in a nutshell, right?
Ain't that and then, just the way?
Yeah, it's really quite good. And honestly, so Hoff does a really good job of introducing people to the concepts of Taoism in a way that's pretty palatable using these characters. And I like how you brought up at the beginning of the conversation that it is, the 100-Acre Wood is kind of like a fairyland, right? That it is very much like this kind of fairy tale type thing going on. And so what these different characters do, honestly, it opened up my eyes to a level of depth to the whole Winnie the Pooh kind of like mythology that I hadn't really appreciated, despite how much time I spent with it in my childhood. But so he gives all kinds of examples of, and it's totally true. If you're familiar at all with how Winnie the Pooh stories
almost
go,
like the characters are supposed to be archetypes, you know?
They are. And Pooh himself really is. He's just a dude who's just kind of floating around things, and it all just works out.
Just vibing, as the kids say.
Yeah, he's just vibing. He was just chilling. And I'll give credit where credit's due to that author, because I think he does a good job giving voice to the characters as he's writing them. He addresses, as he's talking, he treats the characters like they're like meta, they're engaged with him, the author. And so Pooh will talk to him within the confines of the book, right? And they'll dialogue with each other as he's writing, which again, I think is taken from the actual. Is that true? Is that actually in the actual A.A. Milne stories? Because I actually had a version of those stories way back in the day, but it's been probably like 25 years since I read those. So I might be making that up. Oh, you know what it is? It's the Disney movie that you were talking about. The Disney movie, Pooh addresses the narrator.
Oh, like a breaks a fourth wall kind of thing.
He breaks the fourth
wall.
Yeah. In the book, the Hoff book, he has in dialoguing about Taoism and things like that. And it feels true to the character. So it's pretty good.
Actually, if anything, that movie came out, like I said, I think around 2010. They probably would have been influenced by Hoff's book, The Tao of Pooh, when kind of making that movie. So it's actually tail wagging the dog a little bit.
I wonder.
Because that movie came out much later. Whereas,
have you read any of the A.A. Milne stuff?
I mean, it's one of those. I can't really remember.
I don't either.
And anything that I remember about Winnie the Pooh is kind of like you. It's probably more from the cartoon series that we had or watched from the early '90s than it would have been from the actual books.
Hmm.
too.
Um,
But anyway,
you know,
so some of the themes that, and we've kind of discussed some of the themes just because you were talking about the Tao Te Ching, receptivity. Okay, so that, and he uses the phrase uncarved block. Is that because I know he
yeah,
uses
that's
that
super
in
common.
the
Yeah,
Tao of
the
Pooh,
uncarved block for sure.
and then simplicity, which very much you see present, and he contrasts that with the quote unquote wisdom of Owl, right? And we already see that
Right.
because Owl pontificates, and it's a very kind of pompous attitude or pompous character, which again, it's kind of playing with the
Kind of
idea
a
that,
stereotypical academic, right? Ivory
yeah,
tower
yeah,
academic guy, which again, I speak as someone who in another life could have been that guy, right?
mm,
By the grace of God, I ended up being me, for better or for worse. Probably for my repentance, right? But yeah, I could have been a snooty ivory tower intellectual. Um,
we
you
can
know,
tell.
for sure. Uh,
Uh, and then going with the flow is something we've already talked. But yeah, that just sort of like, and again, passivity makes it have a negative connotation, and maybe the whole point is rethinking passivity, not in a negative light. Uh, but then the last one too, I think is interesting, and it's one of those ones where it kind of speaks to the idea that all of these sort of like pre-Christian prophets, like outside of Revelation, whether we're talking Socrates or we're talking Lao Tzu, is they don't have the grasp on fallen human nature in the same way that Judeo-Christianity does. Right? They
yeah,
don't have the fall story to the same. They don't have the recognition of the fall in the same way that the the Moses or the Jewish tradition, and then obviously the Christian tradition have. And so listening to the inner voice or the conscience, which in one sense, like that is one of the most like modern virtues, is be true to yourself, or listen to, that inner voice, listen to that person inside of you telling you the right thing. And that's where maybe the biggest contrast is between that and Judeo-Christianity is, well, that heart can sometimes betray you. That heart is, not necessarily the thing to listen to.
yeah. I think it's actually really important for you to bring this up because the the reality is you can take what Taoism, what Lao Tzu is writing in this book, and really use it for evil. If I'm being honest,
Yeah.
I think that what we have in modern America is a lot of attention being paid on just like doing you, dude. Just going with
Mhm.
your flow, just finding
Well,
out
and yeah,
what your
being
voice
in,
is
like,
and things
living in
like
the
that.
moment, you only live once, like all that kind of
Yeah,
like,
and
yeah,
superficially,
BS.
and not even unfairly, I think that people can read the Tao Te Ching and get that feel from it, get that vibe
Mhm.
from it, right? I think that would be reading modern American
Well,
culture onto
it's
what
it's
type
like
of idea Lao Tzu was actually trying to
you
convey
it's like
2,500 years
once
ago.
you discover the way, you still have to choose. Is somebody else the way, the truth, and the life, or are you the way, the truth, and the life? And it's like you still have that choice once you see that there's a way.
Well, if I was trying to condense what I would say to someone who was just kind of like looking at Taoism and using it as an excuse to just like kind of like not try, not try to
Yeah.
be a good person, let's say. Um, I would say that what Taoism fundamentally is asking you to do is like empty yourself of yourself.
Mhm.
And so Taoism is not saying, oh, do you like shoving food down your face 24/7? Just like do that all the time. Like that's
Yeah.
not what Taoism is telling you to do. Taoism is telling you to remove the passions from you. Remove all the things that fill you up so that you can't hear or so that you can't see, right? Like and so it's very much I mean if you want to get into scriptural language to help understand how I perceive this within my Christian context is you can go to things like um, Elijah finding God in the stillness instead of like the fury, like
Yeah.
uh, you can go to things like Christ saying, "Don't worry about tomorrow; let tomorrow worry about itself."
Mhm.
Or when Christ says, "Let the children come," because you need to be like a child in order to inherit the kingdom of God. Um, when you hear St. Paul talk about renewing your mind and not being beholden to the things of this world, right? pretty much any time in the New Testament when we're talking about the world, right, as like a proper noun, we're referring to all the junk that plugs up our ears and like blinds us,
Mhm.
so that we can't experience God and we can't experience what God would have us be. At earlier conversations, we've talked about how, in my opinion, saints are people who are almost running on instinct because they
Yeah.
have successfully cleansed themselves from all the distractions or all the falsehoods that cause us to make poor decisions based upon this kind of corrupted thinking, corrupted nature that we have. If you can remove all of that from yourself and you're back to just being the image of God and just being like God, then you're absolutely free. You're absolutely free, and everything you do is good. Everything you do is for the benefit of others and for the
Well,
glory of
yeah,
God.
just a natural emanation of the grace that's already exuding from you. I
Absolutely.
mean, because
Um,
that's a common image you'll sometimes see when it comes to uh, the grace of the saints is, well, God is continually pouring out his grace through the Theotokos, right? And the idea is that he's poured it all completely into the person of Mary, and then it's overflowing, it's spilling out, and you're collecting it in your, the cup of your soul. And it's not a matter of if it's going to be filled up, it's how big is the cup. And
right.
so the idea is, to the degree that you are open to receive it, you're receptive to that grace, right? And you're cooperating with it. That's, in a sense, it's not that God's ever going to hold back. And so it's just a matter of, how much is how big is the cup that's going to be filled up.
Right. Right. Um, so I don't know. I guess I don't have too much more to say about it. We didn't cover the Tao of Pooh too much, but honestly, it's more of
No.
like a philosophical treatise, and so it's hard to talk too much about it. It's more like it's a good book. It's really easy to read. Go check it out if you
Well,
want an idea of how
Well,
to
and I was,
engage with Taoism
we
a little
kind
bit.
of
But
we started to talk about this question a little bit. I think it is worthwhile to just be like, why is the Tao of Pooh? Because it was a bestseller, and it is still one of those ones that's in print. It's 40 years later, uh, coming up on the 40th anniversary. Actually, it's the last week of July, so I thought we
hmm,
could post this we could post this the
okay,
week of the 40th anniversary. But that means you can't just be all like go with the flow about editing it, Jacob. So
you know what? It's gonna
yeah,
work out, Mike. It's all just
yeah,
gonna work out.
okay.
I
Oh
ain't even worried
bother.
about it. Oh
Uh,
bother. Oh bother. I'm
so
the uncarved wood, man. Quit
why is it
harshing
so
my vibe.
attractive, or why was it so attractive, or why is it maybe still so attractive to modern Westerners? And so then how can it, just like the Tao Te Ching was taken as a way to bring some of these people into Christianity, like Higher Monk Damascene, Seraphim Rose, uh, how can the Tao of Pooh be used as a way to maybe bring somebody into uh, Christianity, right? Into the Tao of Jesus?
Well,
But why is it so attractive first? That was the first question. Why is it
yeah.
so
Well,
attractive
I
to modern
honestly I think
Westerners?
that's so. Again, it kind of reiterates a little bit. Like I think a lot of people might find Taoism attractive because it doesn't expect anything of them.
Yeah.
It just tells them to like
Well,
just chill.
but
And
maybe
so
that's something worth exploring is like, why is that the thing that we're so desperate for is somebody
yeah,
who's not
well, that's a fair
demanding,
enough point.
like, it's almost like treating people as transactions actually dehumanizes us. And so we're looking for something that doesn't make that same sort of demand, you know?
Well, it's such a rat race, right? Like
Mhm.
life is such a rat race. Life is such a constant effort, constant struggle, right? Another thing that Christ says, um, "My yoke is easy, my burden is light." Right?
Mm.
That kind of flows into the kind of general feel for, I think, where Taoism is coming from, kind of thing. Because he owns nothing. He just travels around. He accepts the generosity of others. Jesus was someone who was at total harmony with like the world around him, kind of thing. And he says this is an easy burden. Even though we know the anguish and suffering that he's going to actually undergo, right? And we know that like he didn't like it. We know that he wept in the garden, but he
Well, yeah.
also like
His yoke
thy
was
will
the
be done
cross,
kind of thing,
right? So
right?
that's the ironic thing Is his
Um,
yoke was easy and his burden was light, but that yoke and that burden was the cross. So
mhm.
it's kind of like, it seems like two contradictory things.
If you really get into a lot of Taoism, it's very paradoxical. It's
Mm,
always about like you can't fill up a jug unless it's empty, but the value of a jug is emptiness, so that it can be filled up with something, right?
mm,
So there's tons of paradox in just like the Tao Te Ching and things like that. Um, I think that people, when they come to Taoism or they come to a book like the Tao of Pooh and things like that, what they might be attracted to is just the sense of peace that
mm,
is being promised there, right? And you can get a lot of peace just by shedding all the crud, even before you get to Jesus. The problem is that people still need to keep moving to Jesus. And
mm,
so they stop too soon, you know? Like, if you get to a place where, because you can go and you can read a book like the Tao of Pooh and realize, wow, I'm just so convoluted. I'm just so obsessed with all the details of life, and it's really stressing me out. And if you can like shed yourself of all that rigmarole, you will absolutely feel 100 times better, right?
mm,
um I would just encourage people to be like, "That was pretty nice, wasn't it? Now imagine what you can be filled with now that
mm.
you've emptied yourself out of all the crud,"
It's
right?
kenosis and then theosis. It's
Yeah.
kenosis. It's the emptying of kenosis before there's the filling of theosis, or the divinization. And
Mhm.
it's about both. And that's why, and we've talked about kenosis in our Prince and the Pauper episode, when we talked about a little bit about, well, it was probably mostly in that one actually. And I was almost thinking, as you were describing, like the attractiveness it sounded very much like Francis of Assisi in a
Sure.
lot of ways, of the,
Well, the monastic
utter poverty, the emptying of himself, and how that became so attractive to so many.
there's a reason why it's Eastern monks, Orthodox monks, that wrote this book, the
Hmm.
Tao of Christ, or Christ the Eternal Tao. Like, it's, and especially in the East, right? I'll just speak for the East here. Like, our magisterium is the monastics, right? Like, they are the crux, the linchpin, everything that we kind of take our cue from, or at least we're supposed to. And as such, the reason why it has such a reputation for being kind of like mystical and kind of woo woo and things like that is because a lot of that, what someone like Saint Francis, right, or any monk worth his salt, I suppose, salt of the earth,
Mm.
would be like,
Retains the saltiness. Yeah.
yeah, like
Yeah.
they're going to exemplify a life of harmony and peace and tranquility, and it's not like they don't work, right? And it's not like it's not
No.
hard work to just like travel around and just like walk the face of the earth insofar as it goes. But it's the peace that transcends all understanding, right? To
Yeah.
use St. Paul's language, that is being captured here. It's what Lao Tzu was trying to find and trying to give to his disciples without revelation. And it's what Christ does bring and does
It's
does give to his
to
disciples.
jump back over here. I mean, it was the wisdom that Socrates was searching for, truly searching for, you
True,
know? And
true.
so it's another kind of facet of the diamond, or another angle, right? Just because we kind of have already seen the parallels between the sort of like, Greek or Western Civ foundation with Socrates and Plato, and how they kind of were considered similarly to Tao Te Ching and Lao Tzu and the Tao Te Ching. Um, and so you can kind of see how they both are supposed to converge ultimately in Christ, even though, right, it was sort of like they were trying to climb up the mountain themselves, whereas the whole point of Christianity is we don't climb up the mountain ourselves. God comes down and carries us up.
Yeah, one of the, if there's anything that we didn't cover enough in this conversation, was more like the day type reality, where like the grace filled. At the end, you could
Well,
call it
there
everything
was a
else. It's just a
sequel to
grace
the
filled
Tao of
life.
Pooh. Did you know that? Called The
No, I
Day
did
of
not.
Piglet. The Day of
Oh,
Piglet.
really?
It's
Oh, that's
actually, it's a
funny.
longer
The
yeah.
Day of
So
Piglet sounds like a horror
uh,
movie.
Well, actually, funny you bring that up. Did you hear about the
They made a
blood and honey?
Yeah, that's right.
We should watch that and do it. No, I don't think that's gonna happen.
I don't know. I did hear about that though.
Yeah.
Well,
no. I mean, if you're satisfied, like I said, this is your baby. Do you want to?
Hey, man, I was satisfied from the moment we hit play.
That's right. You were just here, right? Just being.
Yeah, I'm just being.
That was enough for you.
Whereas
I'm so concerned with creating content.
There was a laptop set up. There was the microphone and an empty chair.
You just sat. Did one of your kids press the button for you? Could you not even?
I just had to sit down. And you know what?
To...
This great conversation, it just flowed out, man. It was trying to get a little Matthew McConaughey.
You listen to that.
All right.
Oh, he's got.
There you go. The Tao of Matthew McConaughey. Yeah, dude.
That's
Matthew
not going to be the title.
Reading the Tao Te Ching on audio.
Friend of the show. You forgot to say friend of the show.
Yeah, friend of the show, Matthew McConaughey needs to do an audiobook of the Tao Te Ching.
Christ, the Eternal Tao. That would be the twist.
That would be very impressive. I promised that I would read the first chapter of the Tao Te Ching. Maybe we'll just kind of like roughly. You can
close us out with it.
Close us out.
Yeah.
I'm almost tempted to do it in a Matthew McConaughey voice, but maybe
you just go with whatever your inner voice.
Whatever's gonna come out. All right, I'm not.
Yeah, whatever the inner voice. Just live in the moment.
That's right. Just be myself, man. The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. The nameless is the beginning of heaven and earth. The name is the mother of 10,000 things. Ever desireless, one can see the mystery. Ever desiring, one can see the manifestations. These two spring from the same source, but differ in name. This appears as darkness, darkness within darkness, the gate to all mystery. Yeah,
snap.
Just let that sink in. Yep, snap.
And
a lot of apophaticism going on there.
I want to thank our listeners for their receptivity for this episode. And nice. I want them to listen to their inner voice. And if the flow tells them to leave a positive review or a 5-star rating, to please do that so that Jacob can be justified in his decision for the topic for today's episode. And I might just let him pick another one. So if we can get some,
don't be an uncarved block. Go ahead and hit that like and subscribe.
Think of this show or the review section as an uncarved block, and you need to put your imprint.
You need to carve that block, man. Carve that block with your likes.
If there is a positive review that specifically points out this episode, I will let Jacob pick more. How's that sound?
Wow. Good luck with that.
I'm the benevolent overlord.
Nice.
Thanks for listening to Voyage Podcast. The Voyage Podcast is a production of Voyage Comics and Publishing, which seeks to create exceptional entertainment informed by Catholic values that inspire people to live a heroic life. Voyage Comics seeks to advance truth and beauty found in powerful stories. To learn more, visit voyagecomics.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.